Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, Senior Vice President, and with me is Tim Anaya, Senior Director of Communications.
Happy New Year, Ro.
Happy New Year, Tim. How's your new year so far? Did you go anywhere special?
I visited my folks for about a week. We were going to go to San Francisco and see a show one day during the holidays, but the cast had COVID, so they canceled the performance. So really, we just stayed in most of the time.
I think a lot of people stayed in. And if you look at the airport situation, it's a big mess. So I wouldn't want to be stuck somewhere.
No, with all the crazy weather, certainly. And then so many flights were canceled due to COVID. I mean, if you're, I can't imagine the nightmare people trying to fly to vacation or fly home.
No, I mean, I don't think that people will be doing much business travel in January. Certainly at PRI, we won't be doing that until this whole Omicron situation dies out, and hopefully it will soon.
I've got my N95 mask here next to my desk, and the numbers are kind of going up and up and up. Sacramento that just reported it was the biggest day ever for COVID cases. I don't know if that's because of delays in reporting or, Omicron is really spreading that fast, but everyone seems to have it.
Yes, I know. Well, in LA County, I think one point last week, we had 27,000 cases reported in a single day. And this is a holiday week. It's a new year. So this is a time that we always talk about the new laws that Californians have to comply with for the year. And Carrie Jackson, is our California fellow, wrote this fantastic op-ed that's going to be posted this week on all of the new laws that Californians now have to deal with, beginning with the minimum wage, which is now going up to $15 an hour for most businesses. For businesses that employ 26 or fewer workers, it'll be $14. It's, again, Tim, another job killer for the state, given that California already has a higher unemployment rate than the rest of the country. So this really makes no sense.
And there's another measure being circulated that would raise it even higher and index it to inflation. So, I guess California may be the minimum wage state, but it also may continue to be the exodus state as businesses flee, unable to afford that, and prices continue to rise as, inevitably higher labor costs are passed on to customers.
Sure. And also, this is going to be tough on small businesses who've already took the brunt of, the closings and the lockdowns during COVID. So, this is unfortunate. And Newsom could have used, again, his emergency powers last year and this year to try to maintain the minimum wage law or try to exempt this new minimum wage law because of his emergency powers, but he chose not to do that. So next on Carrie's list is this mandatory composting.
That is one of the dumbest things. So there's this new law where you have to, all of your food scraps that you normally would throw in the garbage. Well, now, I guess it's a global warming thing. Now you have to put it in your yard waste bin in many communities. I guess you're supposed to get, and this will be a significant cost that I'm sure customers will have to pay, these little food scrap bins that you keep in your kitchen that inevitably will smell. And
Tim, I got one of those. And you're right. You're absolutely right. I thought it's so cheap. It's like $30. And you have to have the special decomposing plastic bag, and you put all of your kind of waste, green waste in there, and it just smells to high heaven. And I stopped using it, and I think it's pointless.
It's all pointless. I mean, none of it is going to have any measurable impact at all on emissions or global warming. And are people really going to do it? I mean, I wonder, do people even realize this law has taken effect? But, is the garbage police going to go through your garbage to make sure you're throwing your carrots?
Oh, there's a fish head.
Here's a fish head. Here's a bit of raw meat that you cut off before
old
making
salad.
that steak. are people really going to do that? And I just don't know. But I think it's very unlikely people are going to have some smelly little bin in their kitchen and keep that up on an ongoing basis. But we shall see.
So next on Kara's list is vote by mail. So this, folks, is Assembly Bill 37, and it requires election officials to mail a ballot to every registered voter in the state. We had this because of COVID, Tim, and I think listeners might know that I never got a ballot. This is the first time in years, and I often vote absentee because I travel. And that this past year was the first time in years that I never got a ballot. I know a couple of other coworkers didn't get one either. So this is rife for fraud.
Well, and it's also confusion. We're used to going to the neighborhood polling place down the block from your house or in the church to vote. And now, we're changing where, everyone's mailed a ballot, and your neighborhood polling place isn't the neighborhood polling place anymore. And they have these big kind of collection centers all over the county and in the run up to the election, where you may not be familiar with where to drop off your ballot. And, you also wonder, is your ballot really secure? Yes, I guess there's an element of convenience where you can drop them off at any of the sites in the county, but it just is more when you kind of take away the routine people are used to and you go to this new setup, people are necessarily going to be confused, and they also might be a little suspicious. So it's definitely the trend in California and other states.
So there are also new prohibitions for restaurateurs. Now, for example, you can no longer, restaurants can no longer hand out those individual condiment packages, call it single-use foodware. This is just another silly law. It's supposed to combat climate change.
Well, it's also it to me, it's like a solution in search of a problem. Is it a problem that people have ketchup packets with every container of French fries? Does the government really need to be dictating to businesses that people have to ask? You just can't hand them ketchup with your French fries. When I walk around, I see a lot of litter. Ketchup packets typically aren't what I see, but it's definitely a trend. We had that dumb bill a few years back about you can't have little hotel shampoo bottles anymore. You have to have big bottles in the shower, which actually can accumulate more bacteria. So it's another one of these, kind of feel-good solutions where I'm not convinced there is a problem in the first place.
That's right. And then one of your favorites, Tim, you've written a lot about this, these new gasoline generators and lawn equipment bans.
There's no doubt that the trend in home lawn equipment, what you or I might use to mow the lawn, that battery powered or solar powered equipment is gaining more market share. Well, that's fine for your one time that you use the lawnmower once a week or twice a month. You can charge it up and be ready to go. Well, if you're mowing 10 lawns a day, that's a lot of backup batteries. You got to have a solar rig potentially on your truck. The new equipment that you're changing over to is very expensive. So this will be a huge impact both on kind of the small mom and pop lawn landscaping businesses, many of which are minority owned, but also it's going to be, significant increases for customers. So it sounds wonderful, but as our Wayne Weingarten has talked about quite a bit, maybe we'll be there in 5-10 years as technology evolves that you can have battery powered commercial grade lawn equipment that lasts all day or lasts half a day, but we're not there yet. And so this really, when it takes effect, is going to have a significant impact on the landscaping business in the state.
Yeah. And, Tim, I wonder who's going to police this when, the small business owner comes in with his, little gasoline blower. Is anyone really going to report poor guy? No, absolutely not. I feel like it's one of these feel good kinds of legislation that progressives in Sacramento want to earn brownie points for. So, and also the next, this is a pretty serious bill actually, which takes effect this year, is a farm animal confinement initiative. Voters might remember it as Prop 12, which decides how certain farm animals, calves, pork, and pigs and hens, the size of their living space. And it sounds ludicrous, but frankly, these farm animals now have to live in larger living spaces before they can sell to Californians.
Well, and it has a huge impact too nationally. This is not just a California regulation. This affects the pork industry nationwide. So even if the pork is produced in other states, it can't be sold in California unless it meets the requirements of Prop 12. So it's another one of these measures that sounds good. It sounds wonderful, right? We want to have the humane treatment of animals, and of course we do. But as a practical matter, it's going to hurt small farmers. It's going to drive up the cost of bacon and pork products, and we might have scarcity problems. So buy your pork now, because it may not be around much longer. Certainly there'll be much less of it on store shelves, and it's not an insignificant amount of money, as our Carrie Jackson wrote about it, for farmers to convert to the requirements of this law. So it's again, it sounds wonderful, but what is the practical effect going to be on Californians? And I think it's something that voters didn't anticipate when they adopted this measure. Our Dan Kolke has a great op-ed in Real Clear Politics that was just published this week, where he talks about the Supreme Court is considering whether to take up a case along these lines. And he goes through all the ins and outs of this issue. And I wonder, too, if this would withstand a legal challenge. It's one thing for California to do what it wants within its borders. It's another thing when California's decisions affect the whole country.
All right. Well, maybe we ought to move on to our next guest, our new podcast guest. It's Chris Wright, who is chairman and CEO of Liberty Oilfield Services, which is a hydraulic fracturing company, fracking company. He's also on the board of PRI. So Chris is one of the pioneers of fracking, studying this concept back when he was a student at MIT. So this is kind of a funny story. So last year, when one of Chris's competitor companies wanted to use North Face, the outdoor clothing company, they wanted to personalize some of their clothing items with this fracking company's logo, and North Face actually turned them down. So Chris, on his own, pointed out in a video the irony of this, because virtually all of North Face's products come from fossil fuels. So in this podcast, Steve Hayward interviews Chris about what had happened with this video going viral. And they also talk about the state of fracking and of course, the progressives' war on fossil fuels. So we think you'll enjoy it.
Yes, it's terrific. And we'll be sure to put a link in the description of this if you're looking on our website, where you can watch the North Face YouTube video. It's one of the disadvantages of having an audio podcast. You can't we can't embed the video, but his video is definitely worth watching. And in the beginning of their discussion, they talk about the impetus behind the video, and it's really terrific.
Thanks everyone for listening, and Happy New Year.
We're delighted you all are joining us, and we're really delighted that Chris Wright from Liberty Oilfield Services is with us. And rather than go through his extensive biography, which is deeply impressive, what I really want to convey, and why I think this will be a delightful hour with Chris, is that he is a highly unusual energy entrepreneur. And to give you a flavor of why I would say that, I want to share with you a 1-minute version of a video he posted several months ago that's gotten several million views, involving a controversy about the North Face sports apparel company. So, North Face, everyone knows them, fancy sports apparel company, declined. I think I'll set you up this way. They declined to produce, as they often do, custom sweaters and jackets for an oil company. And that's when you picked up the story, and take it from there, Chris, if you would.
Yeah, look, and I'm a longtime supporter of North Face. My wife and I are outdoor adventurers and mountain climbers. We love North Face gear. And in fact, for my company, Liberty, we made 2,000 co-branded North Face jackets just at the end of 2018, 3 years ago. They proudly did co-logoing with us. And then this energy message has just gotten more off base and more crazy. So less than a year ago, they decided they wouldn't do it with another company. And that to me is just way over the line. Because not only is all of North Face products literally made out of oil and gas, all their jackets, climbing gear, athletic gear, that is oil and gas. Plastics, petrochemicals are made out of oil and gas. And then, of course, they're made using oil and gas, overseas and shipped on diesel-powered ships over here and ships in stores that are powered by oil and gas. But even more central, all of the activities they're catering towards, mountain climbing, skiing, outdoor adventuring, snowboarding, all that, those are sports that were impossible, simply inconceivable without oil and gas. It's only the arrival of oil and gas in the modern world that has allowed these awesome luxuries of going into the great outdoors.
Right.
And we do it carrying oil and gas, wearing products made out of oil and gas. So that's like bees shunning honey.
Right. So you know what I want to get to the punchline of your video, though, because it was very artful and playful. Because instead of having an angry message saying, gosh, you're a bunch of hypocrites, you don't know what you're talking about or whatever, instead you said, thank you, North Face, for being a partner of the oil and gas industry, with a nice smile on your face. And, I thought that's a splendid way to do it. And it must have disoriented the North Face people. So I'm wondering, did you ever get a response from North Face? I mean, after all, the video got 6 million views and lots of press and lots of attention. Did North Face ever respond or acknowledge your point?
Well, they never responded to me directly, but they did post on their website. There was no press release, so many people didn't see it. But they did, their website was inundated with people that were just shocked that all the stuff they're wearing and buying is made out of oil and gas. So they did post a little notice on their website saying they acknowledge that oil and gas was essential to how the modern world, and in fact, how their company works today. But they were striving to increase the percent of their products that are made out of recycled material. Now, recycled material means they take the fabrics that are made out of oil and gas, they use some more oil and gas through process heat to reform that oil and gas into a new jersey made out of oil and gas. So that's great. I'm all for recycling when it makes economic sense, but it's still all made out of oil and gas. And as you said, Steve, that's not a bad thing. That's a great thing. Oil and gas, it's 60% of global clothing fibers. 60% in the planet are made out of oil and gas because the natural ones, wool and cotton mainly, are just not as high performance. They are. And of course, you can't have today's cotton production or wool production without oil and gas either. Right. But North Face's products are way more than 90% made out of oil and gas. But it's a great thing. That delivers lightweight, breathable, waterproof, high-performance products. That's a celebration. So you're right. We thanked them for being a great customer of ours and together making the outdoors possible for everyone else. In fact, we gave them an award, too. We gave them our 2020 Extraordinary Customer Award because across their entire business line, they're just intimately linked with us. So God bless North Face and God bless the great outdoors.
That's a way to rub it in on virtue signalers. I think we should take a lesson from that. Let's step back for a minute, though, Chris, and acquaint our audience who we've jumped in the middle of the story here. So Liberty Oilfield Services, your company, you're heavily involved in oil and gas exploration and production, heavily involved in advanced technologies involving fracking, which, has become this sort of crazy controversy everywhere. So why don't you very briefly, give us a story arc of, your energy career if you want. You don't have to start at the beginning, but, what you're up to now and what's it all about?
Yeah, well, look, I grew up in the 80s, and the mania then was also nuts about energy, and it was that we were running out of it. We didn't know if it would be in the early 90s or, soon after the year 2000, when we were going to run out of oil and gas, and industrial civilization was going to collapse. So as a kid in high school, this is terrifying. So I went to MIT specifically to work on fusion energy, because without cheap, reliable, affordable energy, you can't have a modern world, and you can't have great lives. So I went to MIT because they had 2 tokamak reactors to work on fusion energy. I went to graduate school at UC Berkeley. I worked on solar energy there. I ended up going back to graduate school at MIT. And then when I started my career, I worked in geothermal, a thing called hot, dry rock. Let's inject water underground, flow it through these hot rocks, produce steam, and make electricity by mining the heat of the earth. So as I say, look, I'm not an oil and gas guy by background at all. I'm just an energy guy. I just want energy that'll make people's lives better. The third of humanity today is still cooking their meals, burning wood and dung. The world needs vastly more energy. Everything we do requires energy. So I'm just a career energy nerd. Only by luck and a gal and a missed paycheck did I get into the oil and gas industry. But I love it. And so, Steve, as you said, Liberty, the company I'm sitting in right now, is a frac company. In fact, we're the second biggest frac company in the world. So we're the service company. Exxon, Chevron, whatever, drills wells. We bring our equipment out on location and design engineering, pump fluid and sand down at high pressure, create these cracks in the rock that allow the U.S. producers to produce oil and gas out of rocks that we've known have been there forever, but they were just untappable. But new technologies, and yeah, we did play some role in that, has allowed this explosion in production of oil and gas. And I celebrate that explosion in production of oil and gas, mainly because it's made oil and gas cheaper and more accessible to all those moderate and low income people in the world that want to rise out of poverty. They want to have a clean propane stove instead of burning wood or dung in their homes and huts.
Yeah. So I hadn't realized that you were that large a player in the field. I know you've been making acquisitions and expanding and whatnot. So let me ask this. First of all, I'm sort of curious if you operate. I know you operate a lot in North and South Dakota and other places in the U.S. Have you branched out overseas? Part one. And part two, my impression is, and I haven't been keeping close tabs of this, but my impression is the fracking revolution is really just getting started. There's large parts of the world and Africa and Asia and elsewhere where we haven't really even started to explore and develop resources that I think are exploitable.
You're right, Steve. It's almost entirely domestic. Canada in there as well. And the reason, I think it's obvious why it started in the U.S., but the reason it's still almost entirely a U.S. phenomenon is we're the only country in the world where the farmer, the ranch owner, the homeowner owns the minerals underneath their property. So we go to drill wells in North Dakota or Texas or New Mexico. Our partner is the landowner. So you can do a partnership with private landowners that's a win-win. They want to protect their farm, grow their crops. We want to produce oil and gas, and you form these great synergistic partnerships. I testified in the United Kingdom House of Lords 7 years ago. There is an awesome shale play underlying the Midlands of England, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. They could have low-cost, domestically produced natural gas. But if you're going to do that in the United Kingdom, your partner is the British government. And they passed these laws to encourage it. Then like 50 Greenpeace protesters were able to shut it down. And so even though it was legal and great regulations on it, it never happened. And now they're paying just an enormous price, shutting down their factories, exporting their blue-collar jobs, heating cost crisis going on in the winter right now. That need not happen. These shale resources are around the world.
Right. Well, once again, you see the importance of property rights to just about everything else, right? And, I would think sooner or later, especially revenue-hungry countries, developing countries are going to realize that even if they don't have robust property rights, it's in their interest to develop the resources because they'll get some royalties from it. So I don't know, sooner or later, people are going to have to come around. I think. Maybe I'm optimistic. I'm not sure. Let me mention.
No, I think so, Steve. Maybe it's another generation, but it will happen, of course.
Yeah. Before I go on to my next question, Chris, I want to alert the viewing audience that if you have a question for Chris, you can type it into the question and answer window. There may be a chat screen somewhere. I'm not sure which format of Zoom we're using today, but certainly the question and answer window, and I'll try and curate them and pass them along. I guess the next question I have is, the big enthusiasm right now. This is a two-part question. So I'm going to start with the negative and then go to the positive. The big enthusiasm right now is ESG, which is short for environmental, social, and governance. And every company has to have an ESG component to their management. You have one. I'll come to your report in a moment. But I want to first start with something that seems ominous to me. There's this great effort going on right now, and it's achieving a lot of success, and it is to constrict capital to the oil and gas industry. The federal regulators are talking about leaning on banks. The Biden administration is talking about trying to get the Federal Reserve and the SEC to frown upon capital formation for oil and gas. And some large investment funds like BlackRock, some mutual funds have said, we want to draw back from investing in oil and gas. And so the question I have for you is what's this all going to mean? Is this going to raise the cost of capital for people in oil and gas? Is it how is it going to affect the industry if this does catch on? And by the way, how might it not backfire, but I wonder if this will create opportunities for private equity down the road, where, if you're leaving returns from an economically viable enterprise, at some point, people with capital are going to say, I'm not going to go along with this virtue signaling. I see an opportunity here.
Yeah, Steve, it already has raised the cost of capital dramatically. A number of banks have pulled out of lending to the fossil fuel industry. Even at the COP, the Congress of the Parties conference in Scotland on climate change, a number of countries, including the US, signed on to a thing saying they will not, mean the government entities will not lend to other countries to develop fossil fuels. That's so far beyond the pale to me. A third of humanity doesn't have access to clean cooking fuels, and we're going to try to stop them so they can keep burning wood and dung and have 2 to 3 million deaths a year. It's outrageous. But right here in the US, it already has risen the cost of capital. Harder to get lending capital, more expensive. Stock market valuations are down, so harder to raise equity capital or more expensive equity capital. It is absolutely already a meaningful force in driving up the price of oil, natural gas, and natural gas liquids. So that movement is moving apace, and it has driven up the cost. You mentioned private equity. Private equity, some of their biggest sources of funds are university endowments, state pension funds, union retirement funds. They are leaders in the ESG. So capital from private equity has dried up even faster than in the public capital marketplace. What's still there, of course, is just high net worth individuals or just thoughtful people that say, hey, the returns are getting better and better investing in fossil fuel. I mean, this capitalism, of course, other money will come in, but less is coming in than has gone out. So when you fill up your tank of gas or heat your house, yes, part of why that price has gone up is a campaign to demonize our industry as somehow evil, even though we make the world go round. I find it just appalling, and which is why I love to engage in the debate.
Right. So just about every big company these days has a ESG report, and I look at some of these, and they're usually PR fluff. Even oil companies, the big majors, they'll have a report that says, "Oh, we're investing in hemp plantations and schools in Rwanda and things of this kind to make the world feel good." You have an ESG report, Bettering Human Lives. We'll link to it online for this episode. And it's a completely different flavor, I must say. I'll put it this way, Chris, is that you take the S part seriously, social, which is, ultimately, I think right-thinking people would say the social part of this should be our human lives being improved. You just referred to energy poverty around the world a moment ago, about how we still have nearly 1 billion people who have no electricity, just to mention one component of energy. Let alone still cooking on dung and wood scraps that they can scrape up. Right. I mean, and you point out in the report, I should actually let you take it from here. I mean, you point out that the expansion of oil and gas is improving lives by the million. And you seem to be unique among people in the energy industry in pointing this out to people. So anyway, talk about that report a little bit, because it's really great fun.
Yeah, the data is compelling. If you want to make people's lives better and make the environment better, it's compelling that the way to do that is actually more access to oil and gas, not less. And Steve, I'll start with the point you began with, which is that, yes, the ESG reports prepared by companies in our industry are extremely disheartening to me. These are companies that are making the world go round, and their reports, feel like an apology. We're sorry, we're in the oil and gas business. We're trying to do more and more to get out of the oil and gas business or produce less, because that's what investors want to hear. And they're responding to a constituency. But I think it's so deeply wrong. And I think it's wrong on two things. Intellectually, it's wrong. Apologizing or feeling bad you're in the oil and gas industry because you think you're hurting people or environment is to misunderstand the environment and human well-being. And then saying it just because people want to hear it. Well, 10 years from now, they're going to want to hear something different. Are you going to change your tune then? So my view has always been that intellectual honesty is critical to everything we do as human beings. And just because everyone might hate what you say or attack you, that's just life. Look, there's so many nutty things going on in the world today that wouldn't be going on if more people just stood up and called it out. And so at Liberty, we feel compelled to do that. So look, this is an 85-page full of graphs, long, nerdy. I think I broke every rule in the ESG report preparation book. But it's actually, I think it's been downloaded 10,000 times from our website. It has caught traction in our industry. And I think what my hope is, not just that we got the message out in this report, but it's to change the messaging of all the other companies in our industry with time. They should be proud of what they're doing. They should be honestly sharing the data and evaluating. Is lowering greenhouse gases, all things being equal, a good thing? Sure. But is it the highest good thing we can do? Greatest investment return? It isn't even close. It isn't even close. So in the report, and then I'll shut up, we cover 3 big global energy challenges and in order of importance. And number 1 is energy poverty. As I already mentioned, 2 to 3 million people die every year, roughly the rate people died from COVID over the last 2 years. We shut the world down for that, but 2 to 3 million people die every year just because they don't have access to clean cooking fuels. Like, that's a tragedy, but of course it's low-income people in poor countries or low-income people in our own country, and politicians generally just don't care about them, and that's wrong. The second biggest global energy challenge is electricity is the most important network in the world because it enables every other network. And as you said, 1 billion people don't have access to it. Another 1 billion people only have marginal low watt access. And even in the wealthy countries, think of California where you live, or the United Kingdom or Germany, we're actually making electricity massively more expensive and less reliable. For a lawyer or an activist, well, they don't care that much about it. But for moderate income people, this is making their lives worse and shrinking their opportunities. That's global energy challenge number 2. And global energy challenge number 3 is climate change. And we cover climate change in detail, an overview of the chemistry and physics, the data, a whole section on climate economics, which is the work done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to put these all in context. And I think it would be hard to order those 3 global energy challenges any differently.
Yeah, I want to linger on this point of ESG for a moment. There is something perverse and obviously self-defeating by taking the attitude, we're sorry that we've made your life better. We're sorry that we're able to provide you cheap products from North Face jackets to fuel for your car to let you drive around. And if you start from that standpoint, you're going to be on the defensive, endlessly. So here's the question, and I have to be delicate about this because I don't want to call out particular companies or organizations, many of whom I know quite well and talk to frequently. But why is it that almost nobody in the oil and gas industry defends themselves with the affirmative message, with the vigor that you do? What's the matter with everybody?
Well, the real answer is I don't know. I've been fighting this battle for 20 years and obviously not much luck, but it's getting more traction now. So look, I'm an optimist. Part of it is, look, our industry has a terrible track record of public relations, right? When I was in high school, and look, I'm not a young guy. When I was in high school in the 80s, everybody knew the oil and gas industry was bad, didn't care about the environment, were polluters. Think of Dallas and J.R. Ewing. They were the bad guys. So, that's been known forever or believed forever. So people just keep their head down, deal with the regulators, deal with the people they need to, but not with the public. If you're drilling on someone's land, you're dealing with them and the neighbors, but you don't deal with the broader public. And then, people just plowed ahead and done their business. And when our industry did speak, it was sort of carefully polished bullet points that went through legal and PR. So they were so insincere, no one believed them, and no one should have believed them. That kind of communication is just wrong. Open, honest, candid, because an open and honest, candid dialogue about what we do is such a great story. Do we have negative impacts? Of course. Do we make mistakes? Of course. We're human beings. Are we perfect? Hell no. As I say, we cause a dime's worth of damage around the world in our activities. That's real. But we cause a dollar's worth of benefit. And we only talk today about how we're going to make that dime 8 cents or 7 cents. And we should talk about that. And we do in our report as well. But the bigger subject is how are we going to make that dollar $1.25 or $1.50? How are we going to make human lives better? We show a picture in our report of the island of Hispaniola, with Haiti to the west and Dominican Republic to the east. Haiti is deforested because too many of their people still live like all of our ancestors did on traditional fuels, burning wood and dung. Poorer, worse lives, much bigger footprint in the environment. Dominican Republic consumes 7 times more energy, but they're wealthy enough that everyone gets their energy from oil and gas. So they have a healthy rainforest, cleaner air, a tourist economy to go visit their nature. So it's not just for humans, but for the environment itself. Oil and gas has negatives, but way bigger positives than the negatives. And it's maybe a more complicated argument, Steve. People don't want to get into that. They keep their head doing their business. But that's proven a very costly mistake, because now we're defined by our opponents and not defined by ourselves. So my hope is we're going to see that tide turn, and our industry is just going to be more honest and forthright about the trade-offs and what we actually do.
Yeah. By the way, who else shows that photo of the Haiti Dominican Republic border? You may know this. Al Gore used to show that in some of his slideshows and get exactly the wrong lesson from it. He'd say, this shows what happens when we don't have renewable. I don't know. He says all kinds of nonsense when the real issue is, yes, they use fossil fuels in the Dominican Republic and they have property rights. One of the problems with Haiti is you cut down the trees when no one owns them. And there's no incentive to preserve them and cultivate them, right? It's and yet there is sort of a willful, I don't know if it's stupidity or ignorance or just what, or blind commitment to an ideology. I do have one insight, perhaps, on why the oil and gas industry, quite a long time ago, went in the soft route of public relations. And it's almost 30 years ago when Ken Durr was chairman of Chevron. He was very sound, by the way, and used to fight vigorously a lot of silly environmental nonsense in California and elsewhere. But he told me one time something interesting, and you can see why it may have led people off the rails. Some viewers might remember with long memories that Chevron had an ad series back in those days called the People Do campaign. And it was all about how we build refineries, but we also protect the wildlife around them. We're good stewards of the land. And Ken Durr said, to his shock and surprise, and to the company's surprise, those ads that were sort of feel-good marketing ads, public affairs ads, did more to sell their gasoline than their marketing ads to encourage you to buy their gasoline. And you can see how that might work. On the other hand, I think that started a lot of the industry off the wrong path, and now they can't get out of it. And what's curious about that, and I'll move on to a different one, is, you follow all the nonsense that comes out of these COP meetings and, our own president saying we're going to be net neutral for carbon emissions by 2050 or whatever. And then I notice, and I follow these things as you do, I will look at the long-term energy forecasts from the people who really know the subject, the International Energy Agency in Paris, our own Energy Information Administration, the long-term projections from BP or Exxon, which do these very good annual reports. And what they all say is we look out to the year 2050 and we see renewable energy increasing a little bit, but 80% of the world's primary energy is still going to come from oil, gas, and coal. So here's this disjunction between the aspirations of our politicians and North Face, I suppose you can add in, and then the real experts who actually know where we're going to go and where we're going to have to go. It seems to me that fact is going to be decisive in the long run in stripping away a lot of the nonsense.
Oh, Steve, without a doubt. A lot of people immediately say, oh, you're just trying to defend your industry. You're afraid of wind and solar. You're trying to defend your market share. And I say, absolutely not. I worked in solar power. I worked in fusion energy. In fact, I'm again working in geothermal energy. I don't care where energy comes from. And I run a public oil and gas company. So of course I care about that. But yeah, the risk to our market share is virtually non-existent. And to put that in some historical context, when Kyoto happened, the Kyoto Accords, it sort of started this global, let's set targets and drive down greenhouse gas emissions. So 1992, so 30 years ago, in that year, the world got 87% of its primary energy from fossil fuels. Yeah. Now we're 30 years later, trillions of dollars of subsidies, untold pronouncements, and 87% has gone down to a little more than 83%. So we've gone down, say, 3.5% market share in 30 years. How much do you think it's going to get down in the next 30 years? 3%? And of course, the low-hanging fruit is the start. It might be more than 3%. It might be 5 or 7%. But yeah, I think it's highly likely that total primary energy in the world in the year 2050 will be at least 75% from hydrocarbons. That's just math and physics.
Yeah.
Wind and solar globally, right? We spend a ton of money globally. They have risen to 10% of global electricity. And electricity globally is 20% of total energy consumed, right? There's transportation fuels, industrial fuels, all that. So wind and solar are a little more than 2% of global energy today. 2%. People think they're 20% or they're on their way to displacing everything. It just doesn't work that way. Energy is hard, energy is difficult. And the biggest source of decarbonization in the United States and globally by far has been the growth of natural gas and its displacement of coal in the electricity sector in rich countries and plateauing of global coal consumption. Not shrinking global coal consumption, but plateauing it. That's by far the biggest needle mover. If your target or your passion is greenhouse gas movements, that's what's moving the needle today. Nuclear should be a player in that as well, and hopefully will coming forward.
Oh, I want to ask you actually several technical questions about several different parts of it, including, your own company, your own industry, but also some of these others you've mentioned. So let's go back to nuclear and fusion. You mentioned you studied fusion, way back when at MIT. And, I've toured some of the fusion labs, the Max Planck Institute in Munich, I visited over a decade ago. I've been to the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab. And then I try to read some of the literature, and my half joke about it is fusion energy has always been 10 years away for the last 50 years. I don't know how closely you're keeping up with it, but let's take them one at a time. There's nuclear. We're trying to build a couple of plants. The Europeans are. China's building a lot of them. But it still seems to be very high cost. And I'm not quite sure I understand why we can't drive the cost of that down. And then I'd also be interested in what you think about whether we're going to get fusion at some point, because it seems there's lots of talk about it, but I can't tell if we're really making any progress.
Well, starting with fission, so sort of modern or existing nuclear power, I'm a huge fan of it. Look, it started very fast. It went from bomb-making technology to a first generation, maybe a second generation reactor, and then we built a bunch of them. And their safety record is still the safest way to produce energy globally by far. And that's like generation 2 built quickly. Today, with smaller modular reactors that if something goes wrong, they automatically shut off. That's very easy to do. There are a number of companies developing those technologies. The problem of nuclear and the cost is regulatory, politically driven fear, which drives insurance up, and an inability to innovate. Because if you change one thing in the reactor design, your 10-year approval starts over again. So we've stifled innovation there. But you're right. The renaissance, unfortunately, of nuclear is first going to be in China and in India and in Russia. They're building nuclear reactors. I believe we will build them again in the United States. If you really want to drive down greenhouse gas emissions, this is a needle mover. So the technology, because it's like fracking. If something's successful and people don't understand it and it doesn't feel good to them, you get massive opposition. The environmental movement hates nuclear and they hate natural gas, which tells you they're not serious about climate change. Fusion, next generation, which is what powers the sun and the stars and the dominant energy source in the universe, which is basically high pressure and high temperature, squishing together hydrogen to make helium or helium to make boron. This is a very hard problem. And you're right. It was 20 years away when I went to school, and it's 20 years away today. But it has made a lot of progress. In fact, today there was an announcement. A private fusion energy company in Massachusetts raised $1.5 billion of private capital today. That's never happened before. Big money into a private fusion business. There's a big reactor, ITER, being built in Europe. And higher temperature superconductors, because you need these strong magnets and huge currents, computing power. There are things that have moved this forward. Fusion humans are ingenious. Fusion's going to come. But it probably is technically 20 years away now. And then to be commercially deployed, maybe it's another 10 or 20 years. So it's still a bit away, but it's not forever away. And I'm very excited about that. And it will be an awesome way to produce electricity, as is nuclear. The problem, again, is 20% of global energy is electricity. So there's still, it's just so hard to envision. We are generations away, and my guess, not in the next few centuries will we have a society without copious use of fossil fuels. Because modern medicine, think of plastics. You can't build a wind turbine without fossil fuels. You can't build a solar panel without fossil fuels. You can't build a nuclear power plant without fossil fuels. You can't have modern medicine or the internet without fossil fuels. So it's not just their energy content, but also the materials themselves. The carrier fluid in the vaccines for COVID comes from fossil fuels. It's the basis of organic chemistry. So look, their role or impact is much broader than just energy sources. How are you going to fly an airplane? Maybe someday with a nuclear reactor, 100 years from now, I hope. But so in any case, we're going to continue to change the electricity sector. I'm good for whatever's better. But right now, subsidizing wind and solar and mandating it is just dramatically increasing the human footprint on land. And it's making electricity more expensive and less reliable. Like, I don't see the win in that. And of course, it's a trivial movement in greenhouse gas emissions.
Yeah. By the way, let's spend a little minute on electricity, in part because you mentioned your figure from your report that, roughly speaking, oil and gas has 10 cents of cost for every dollar of benefit. That's a calculation that's very seldom done or observed or acknowledged by people. Meanwhile, we're all going to drive electric cars. And yet very few people, you have, Mark Mills, a few others, have pointed out that the raw materials requirements and the whole supply chain and manufacturing, I'm not sure what the ratio would come, but it's not clear to me that it's superior to the 10 cents in dollars in benefit that you mentioned earlier. But maybe talk briefly a little bit about, what are the actual resource and environmental trade-offs involved in electrifying everything?
Yeah, good question. Rich topic. One thing to say up front is when you do an analysis of different ways to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, whether it's land use or different source of electricity or whatever, electric cars rank near the bottom, meaning they're incredibly expensive ways to get relatively modest reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So if this was about math and science and greenhouse gases, we wouldn't talk much about electric cars. Maybe they have a benefit of cleaner air in cities, because the point of combustion to make the energy is not at the car, it's over here at a power plant. So China's driving towards electric cars because it helps clean the air in their cities. That's a good thing. That's a human interest. I'm not against electric cars, but they're not meaningful movers in greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, thoughtful politicians, which is maybe a very small subset, know this. But they're politically popular, right? Because who's their political constituency is sort of wealthy, well-educated people, and they love electric cars. They sound sexy. We're going to save the world by me driving a sexy car and getting paid to buy it and paid to charge it. So, they're politically popular. But look, electric cars were number one in market share a little more than a century ago in powering automobiles. Number one. Steam was number two. And internal combustion engines were number three in market share. Electric cars were over 30% of all the cars built. And then they've continued to improve. Batteries have improved in sort of an energy density thing, maybe a factor of 6 or 8 in that last century. But internal combustion engines have improved by a factor of 100, right? So they just lost out in a competitive marketplace. And the reason is energy storage, batteries, is hard. The physics, chemistry, and materials of it is just a tricky problem. We're making progress, but it's actually, in a technological scale, it's not tremendously fast. We had rapid decreases in production costs just by scaling everything up, but that's sort of been done. We're probably going to see gradual decreases in the cost of batteries in the next couple of decades, maybe even increases, because the critical metals that are needed in these batteries are in short supply, and demand for them is growing up rapidly. So yeah, it's essentially, if we did move, I'm not convinced we will, but if we move super rapidly to electric cars, we need massive growth in the mining industry. And mining is like oil and gas. It makes the world go round. I love the mining industry, but it would have to ramp up enormously. And of course, China has foreseen that. Rare earth metals are not rare, they're everywhere, but they're very energy intensive and a little bit nasty to process. So China's got, 80+% of the rare earth metal processing. So, the US just became energy independent for the first time since I was born 2 years ago. And the more you build solar panels or wind turbines or electric cars, that's just awesome for China. They built their economy around it. They built the polysilicon for solar panels. They process the rare earth metals. They process cobalt. They process all the energy intensive stuff that it's needed to make these products. And so they would love it if the world goes nuts. It's great for their sort of industrial base. But the world is 83% fossil fuels. China's 90% fossil fuels, and no prospect of meaningfully changing that. So when you export manufacturing from the US or the UK to China, you're not being green. You're shrinking your greenhouse gas emissions here in California. You're just growing them, but moving them over to China.
Yeah. So, I think the figure I've heard from, I think Mark Mills and a couple other people, is that to make a battery for an all-electric car, a Tesla or one of the other models that's coming along, requires something like 400,000 or 500,000 pounds of raw material you dig out of the earth for each battery by the time you refine it all, right? And, requires huge open pit mines. And so, leave aside whether there's actually that much lithium to go 1,000x, right?
The mining number is 500,000 tons.
Tons, sorry, right.
500,000 tons of earth have to be moved to make the battery in one Tesla. In one Tesla. And also in that one Tesla, there is 1,000 pounds of oil and gas, 1,000 pounds of plastic in a Tesla, which is made from oil or natural gas. You can do it a little bit from both. But yeah, so, they get these zero emission. They're zero emission at the point of driving them, but very energy intensive to make them. Of course, it takes energy to charge the batteries and all that. They get, depending upon where you are, they do have lower greenhouse gas emissions. If you're in Norway, where almost all your electricity comes from hydropower, and you're a rich country because of oil, and you have massive subsidies, you can have 40% of the cars on the road are electric. But the funny thing is, Norway went to 40 or 50% of their cars are electric today. Their oil consumption didn't decline at all. Right. Because when people go skiing or vacation or drive longer, they drive their internal combustion car. When they commute to work or do smaller stuff, most people that buy an electric car, it's generally not a replacement for another car. It's wealthy people sort of buying a third car for the family, And again, I'm not against electric cars. I'm against subsidizing them and making them more expensive, making that burden on lower income people who don't buy electric cars. My brother bought an electric car living outside of Boulder, and I made him a bumper sticker, and God bless him for putting it on. And the bumper sticker said, "Powered by coal, paid for by you." And the reason for that is in Colorado, we're behind the times with the rest of the nation at the time he bought this car, and coal is our largest source of electricity. I'd love to say powered by fracking, because 40% of US electricity comes from natural gas today and only 20% from coal. But I got to be honest, when Bill bought his car, coal was number one in Colorado. And the subsidies, federal, state, and Boulder County paid like $22,000 of the $30,000 car. And even the $30,000 car, it cost Nissan more than $30,000 to make it. They also sold it as a loss to make their zero emission vehicle standards. So to see everyone else, all the taxpayers subsidizing well-off people to buy things that don't meaningfully move the needle, I think is just wrong. If electric vehicles can compete in the marketplace, God bless them, bring it on, and I'll buy one.
Yeah. So, by the way, here's a calculation that for you or maybe our friend Robert Bryce or someone to do for your next report. I'm trying to think of a way of visualizing 500,000 tons. And I don't know what it would be, but my first object to measure and compare might be the Great Pyramid of Giza. I don't know if that's 500,000 tons or 5 million tons. I don't know, but it'd be interesting to reduce each battery, the raw materials, into a pyramid size, because I think it'd be a great visual. Anyway, there's an idea to play with down the road a little bit. Let me turn to geothermal energy, which you mentioned. I've always understood that the difficulties of geothermal were twofold. One is if you tried to put geothermal plants where there was activity near the surface, like Geyserville here in California and a few other places, it's often in seismically sensitive areas where you worry about earthquakes if you drill too much. I think that's actually happened a few times. Or the other problem is if you're trying to get down to hot rocks in a more geologically ordinary place, the temperatures and pressures of drilling down that far become very costly and prohibitive and difficult. So first of all, you comment on those two statements I just made, if I'm right or not quite right. And then the obvious question is the technology improving such that those problems of temperature and pressure are receding?
Yes, is the answer to the last question. So yeah, those are true. Where geothermal power is produced today is places where there's heat very near the surface of the earth and fractures. So these are along plate boundaries, California, the Philippines, Japan, Nicaragua. So on the Pacific Rim, where the plates, geologically, the plates are coming together, heat's closer to the surface. So those are seismically active areas. And if you remove fluids or put fluids, can you induce small earthquakes? Yes. I don't think it's a big problem, but it's an issue for sure. It's been managed, I would say, reasonably well. But those are unique places. The idea of next generation geothermal is to not need the unique places where not only is the rocks hot, but they're already fractured and they're full of water. That's traditional geothermal. You got to drill down, it's got to be fractured, got to be hot, got to be full of water. We're going to produce that water out and produce electricity. The idea of next generation geothermal is to go, the middle of Nevada or Utah or somewhere where it's less seismically active, but it's hot underground. Maybe there's not a lot of fractures. Inject the water underground, flow it through these very hot rocks, use technologies to monitor where it's going, and drill another well, a horizontal well. Now we can drill those cheaper in hotter, tougher environments and produce up hot water and steam and produce electricity. You're essentially mining the heat of the earth without moving the rocks. You're just injecting water from the surface and then producing hot water. You liberate energy from that. You take the heat out of that water, and then you re-inject that same water back underground and heat it again. So it's just mining the heat of the earth. What's great about this is higher energy density, takes a small surface footprint to create meaningful amount of energy, which is not true of wind or solar. And you decide the rate at which you inject water and the rate at which you produce water. So it's dispatchable. You get electricity when the sun is down and the wind's not blowing and whatever the weather is. In the old days, humans required, I also showed a graph in our report that humans have had essentially all renewable energy throughout all of time. It depended upon the seasonal weather flows, right? Growing crops, growing trees, the wind and sails. So it's low energy density and it's variable. There's good years and tragic years, which is why humans throughout all of time were desperately poor and life was uncertain. The two things created the modern world. One, human liberty, property rights, bottom-up social organization, hence the name of our company. And the other was reliable, cheap, dense, affordable energy from fossil fuels. Those two things have more than doubled human life expectancy in the last 200 years. So when you move in energy, you want more reliable, smaller land footprint, better energy sources. So coal was much better than wood. People say, you must hate coal. I'm like, no, it's way better than trees. A third of humanity still lives burning trees. God bless, they need coal or oil or something cleaner and more dense to burn. And then, oil is better than coal and gas is better than oil and nuclear is better than gas. So we want dense, low impact energy sources. But geothermal fits in that category as well. A small footprint at the surface can drill wells that could be miles long underground, just injecting cold water and producing hot water and steam. That is a low impact way to produce zero carbon and dispatchable, meaning when you hit the light switch, they go on electricity.
Right. Yeah. By the way, I've always illustrated for students and audiences the idea of energy density through music. And by I say music, I will hold up an old 8-track tape, and it has 8 or 10 songs. And then maybe a cassette will hold 20 songs. And then I'll hold up an iPod Nano, which will hold 1,000 songs, back when we still had the iPod Nanos, right? The little thing that was the size of a postage stamp. And I'd say that's a nuclear power plant, right? And, record albums were true. I forget how I did it, but you get the point, right? And that's a good way to convey it, I think, to a lay audience who otherwise doesn't understand BTUs and all the other measurements that we use. There's another part of the whole story, though, that I want to bring up, and that's, people like you are geniuses at finding the energy resources and extracting them and producing them, but then you have to get them somewhere. You either need power lines for electricity or you need pipelines, mostly, I think, for gas and oil. And needless to say, we're constricting all those things. Our president foolishly canceled the Keystone Pipeline. Say a little bit about the infrastructure problem, because that's going to be one of the choke points, I think, and one of the difficult parts of getting this right.
Steve, tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people will needlessly die this winter because of lack of infrastructure. the question you just asked. This is this is sort of the peak battleground right now on this sort of delusions about energy. We've changed market share 3 percentage points in 30 years, but somehow everyone believes we're going to change it by 80 percentage points in 10 years or 30 years. It's just not going to happen. Full stop, not going to happen. But that widespread belief, that myth that people buy into, has led reasonable people, moderate politicians, to oppose the constructing of pipelines, energy infrastructure for the US to export natural gas. And that has just massive human implications. In India right now, the price of natural gas is 5 times higher than it is in the United States. Same in Europe, same in Asia. And the reason is because we produce our natural gas right here in the United States, and we move it by pipeline. And then you can move it on ships overseas, and then that costs a few bucks. But we have a limited amount of ability to export it. So the world has a shortage of natural gas where the consumers are in India, in Europe, and in China, and in Japan. But there's no shortage of natural gas. And in Massachusetts, there's no shortage of natural gas. It's just a shortage of the ability to move it. Massachusetts is exactly the same problem. Enormous natural gas production in Pennsylvania, a couple hundred miles away. And there's pipelines that bring gas there, but not enough. So the marginal gas that comes into Massachusetts comes on a liquefied natural gas tanker, mostly from Russia. So they pay $30 an MCF, where in the US, it's $4 or $5 today. So the people of Massachusetts, that hurts manufacturing in Massachusetts. Most of it's already left New England. It hurts home eating. It hurts people's lives because we oppose this infrastructure. And what's the highest use of natural gas in India? It's to make fertilizer. Fertilizer is the food that food eats, right? Natural gas is just essential for the synthesis of nitrogen. If we took natural gas, if you got rid of fossil fuels tomorrow, human food production would drop by 50% within 12 months, simply because we couldn't synthesize nitrogen fertilizer, which is both made with and made out of natural gas. So by making natural gas expensive, we have fertilizer plants shut down, fertilizer prices going through the roof. This is driving up the price of basic grains and food. And if you're low income and just scraping by in India, and your grain prices are going up 50 to 100%, the people that are really on the margin are going to die this winter. And they're going to die because we oppose and prevented the building of infrastructure to move energy from where it's produced to where people need it. This is just deeply wrong.
Yeah, I've often said a few minutes ago, you were talking about how really the last 200 years, large and larger parts of humanity have escaped from poverty because of liberty and energy, which I always say is the master resource. It's probably not a coincidence that we are now more than 200 years from our last serious famine because of a crop failure, not a political crop failure like you have from time to time, right? And you're right. You just laid out a scenario for pitching us back into mass famine if we were to follow this madness literally. It is amazing. Let me ask you a particular question about your industry and even your company, because I've read a few articles about how you're tackling some of the technical challenges that are getting ahead of, I might say, some of the regulatory proposals. So I haven't kept up with the details, but supposedly the Biden administration is going to generate a whole bunch of new rules on methane leakage or emissions from oil and gas wells. And I know I've been talking to you and other people in the industry. It is a problem, especially when you're producing oil, that you'll get some natural gas and there's not a good economic way to capture it. And so it's often flared off. And it's a shame to be losing a resource like that. But again, if we don't have pipelines or infrastructure to capture it and ship it, what are you going to do? So I wonder if you'd comment on, the methane rules to the extent what may be coming at you. And I know that you guys at Liberty Oilfield are working on advanced technology on the subject.
Yeah, I'd love to dive into that. Yeah, look, by background, I'm a tech nerd. When we started Liberty, it was like, this is how people do frack today, but we got a bunch of ideas about how to do it different. Very early on, we built frack fleets that didn't just burn diesel fuel, but burn natural gas. Now we have fleets we're building that are 100% powered by natural gas and don't use diesel. That's at transition time. We figured out ways to move sand that got rid of the dust and the noise. We made frack fleets that are quiet. A frac fleet is the power of a 747 jet engine. So it's an enormous amount of concentrated power. And here in Colorado, in a 2-year effort, we made them so quiet that the closest you could drill a well to a house was 500 feet. You can't hear it 500 feet away.
Wow.
So we've used big data and databases we built to figure out how to optimize the production. So you need to drill less wells, smaller environmental footprint to develop the same resources. In 10 years, the cost of an average shale well is cut in half, and the productivity of an average shale well is doubled. So think of that, a 4-fold decrease in the cost to produce oil and natural gas in shale. So this has had just enormous. One other data point, Steve. Sorry, I'm a data nerd.
No, please do.
From the year 2000 to 2008, the United States averaged 1,200 rigs drilling for natural gas. Look, which is a third of U.S. primary energy. A third comes from natural gas. We had 1,200 rigs drilling for it, and we were the largest importer of natural gas in the world. So we produced a lot. We were the biggest importer. Today, we have 100 rigs drilling for natural gas. Not 1,200, 100. And we're the third largest exporter of natural gas in the world. So it's a story of efficiency, smaller land impact, smaller humans required. So of course, it's led to the downsizing of our industry, which is personally painful for people in the industry, but it's a story of efficiency. It's more people doing other things now. And it's lowered the price of energy, shrunk the environmental footprint of it. So, but as I said, our industry is not perfect. The most visible flaw of our industry is what you just said, flaring. If you fly over North Dakota, which produces now more oil than 6 OPEC nations, if you fly over at night, you see all these lights, all these candles. That's flares burning natural gas. Because where that well is drilled, there isn't a pipeline there yet that can take that gas, put it in another pipeline, bring it to Chicago to make electricity or heat someone's home or make petrochemicals to make medical equipment. So it's just burnt on location. Economically, that was the right thing. But look, the world's getting richer and we want to be more and more careful of our environment and keep shrinking the footprint. Not just the global environment, but the neighbors. Nobody wants to live, a mile away from a big old candle. So yes, our industry's made enormous progress on this in the last decade. I'd say flaring is way more than cut in half. And then to put a broader number, in the US, between venting and flaring, venting's even worse, which is just methane escaping. Right. In the US, we're around 0.6% of the methane that's produced is not beneficially consumed, 0.6%. The global average is around 3%. So when the Biden administration wanted to push, we're not going to drill on federal land, for climate or environmental reasons. Like if we stop drilling here, it doesn't change the demand for oil and gas one iota. It just means it's not produced here and it's produced somewhere out the United States. So we know for sure more methane is going to be vented to the atmosphere, more pollutants are going to be created, more greenhouse gas emissions, and the economic benefits will go somewhere else, not in the US. Believing that not drilling here is somehow environmentally beneficial is just backwards. Sitting here in Denver, and Steve, you're in California, the biggest source of smog, ground level ozone in the Western United States, the single biggest source is blown in from Asia, right? It's blown in, it's like 40%, right? So you want to have cleaner air in California? By far, the biggest thing you can do is produce way more natural gas in the United States, build LNG export terminals like the one in Oregon that's been fought for 20 years. They're going to build one in Western Canada and make it cheaper and easier to get natural gas to China and Vietnam and Taiwan so that you'll reduce coal burning, you'll reduce industrial use of coal and burn a cleaner fuel. We'll get cleaner air, lower greenhouse gas emissions, better economic benefits for the United States, and raise people out of poverty in Asia as well. Like everyone wins from that, but environmentalists hate it. Not because it's not good for climate change or air pollution or any of those things, but because they've got much more of a faith-based, fossil fuels are bad. Yeah. And these 7 people have written that we can run the whole world on wind and solar. Of course, there's these very irresponsible papers, which really are only about the electric grid, which again is only 20%, but there's no hope of it doing the electric grid either. You're never going to fly a plane or make steel or make cement or plastics or fertilizer out of wind and solar. I'm not against those technologies. Solar has a future. It will grow. I'm a fan of solar power. Wind, just the math just doesn't work. Takes 10 or 20 times more steel and cement to produce the same amount of unreliable intermittent power from wind than it does from oil and gas.
Yeah, well, I mean, I always like to say that wishful and foolish thinking from the left is one truly inexhaustible resource, although it's really more of an externality than a resource, of course. But we have about 2 minutes left, Chris. And so the last question is, what's next for Chris Wright? And I guess I put it two ways. You can answer that in the energy sphere. And I'm going to plant this mischievous question because I think I know the answer. But is there any chance we can get you to enter the world of politics, to actually enter the fray? I know the risk-reward ratio between being an entrepreneur in energy and in politics is completely upside down and backwards and averse. But I think I have to ask you that question anyway, because you'd be good at it.
Look, I do get asked that a lot. And honestly, if I could be governor tomorrow or whatever, I would do it. I mean, look, I would love to try to bring some sobriety to public policy in that discussion. But I think my odds of winning are low. And in fact, I had this dialogue with Milton and Rose Friedman and my wife Liz and a few friends at my house 15 years ago. And my wife and friends were all for it. I'm on the fence. And he was absolutely against it. Look, you've got a competitive advantage of what you're doing. Yeah. Politics is a dirty, ugly business. You're going to have to play by dirty, ugly rules. You know, I think that's a bad idea. And I'm a big fan of his. So I generally agree with his assessment as well. But look, politics is incredibly important. And God bless the people that are going into that are trying to push things in a positive direction for bottom-up social organization. My whole passion is for people to rise out of poverty, not just in the third world, but here in the US and get better opportunities. And there are many, many people tirelessly fighting to get into office and to advocate good policies, and God bless them, because that is a hard business. And so my hat's off to them. So what's next? This story of people rising out of poverty, it's been my lifelong passion. That's not going to change. So pushing further for school choice. I co-chair an organization. We now have 7,000 low-income kids on scholarships in K through 12 to get them on a better trajectory in life. And I'm going to dedicate more and more of my time, Steve, to energy poverty. Because one of the other problems in this ESG thing, I'll end with this point, is greenhouse gas emissions. Oil company can pledge a 40% reduction, 8 years from now, and they can track it every year. We were 7% lower this year and 6%. It's quantifiable. And if you can measure something, people love those metrics. Yeah. But we don't have real-time data about the roughly 100 million people this year that are first going to get clean cooking fuel that didn't have it last year. Their health is better. Women get 2 hours a day back that they used to spend searching for fuel wood and walking with buckets to get water. If you have energy, you can have clean cooking fuel and you can power a pump to get groundwater. You change people's lives enormously by doing this. So I want to do two things in that regard. One is I want to get direct on the ground metrics that I want to report in our ESG report of how many people's lives are getting better by access to energy. This is just a massively more important needle, an urgent needle. Climate change is real, but it's slow moving and relatively gradual. The IPCC's own economics is, might be a couple % loss to global per capita GDP at the end of this century. That's real, that's big, but that's nothing compared to people's lives being impacted today, having their utilities turned off in California because it's too expensive, or they lost their job because the energy intensive manufacturing left the US and went somewhere else. So I both want to quantify these so we can have annual metrics to celebrate. And in states, I want to track electricity access, cost and reliability, so we can call out the states like California. Colorado's going to go this same direction. The states that are making their electricity more expensive and less reliable, they're not moving the needle on climate change, but they are moving the needle on the quality of life of moderate and low income people. And they're moving that needle in the wrong direction. And I want to get our company directly involved, likely in Africa, in bringing cook stoves and getting that, helping. This is already happening by market forces, God bless. I want to go try to accelerate that and get tens of thousands of more making the transition from traditional fuels to clean cooking fuels as fast as we can. That work's meaningful to me and it's meaningful to people in our company. And I want to do more work with that on the ground. So that's I guess that's what's next. Steve, it was great being with you today.
Yo, Chris, that's a great note on which to end. And I want to thank you very much for joining us. Thank you, viewers, for tuning in. And we are at the end of our hour. And so we're going to adjourn very abruptly and thank everyone for coming. And I hope you'll come again soon.
Thanks so much.
If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.